Hey, this is a video response to Together for Peace's video entitled Using the Bible as Evidence. I've put a link to his video to the right of the screen. Together for Peace argues that biblical texts can and should be used as historical evidence. In particular, historical evidence of the events in Jesus' life. As Together for Peace puts it, Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. There are a number of things one could discuss under this rubric, but as the hymn I used at the beginning of the video hints with some degree of irony, the one on which I'd like to concentrate is whether the Bible can be relied upon as historical evidence for Jesus' resurrection from the dead. It seems fair to say that the resurrection was the focal point of Together for Peace's video, too. First, early in his video, while discussing some details pertaining to the Apostle Paul's letter to the Galatians, which was written sometime in the middle of the 1st century CE, between approximately 50 to 57, Together for Peace notes that this was only 20 to 30 years after the life of Jesus. If Jesus had not been raised from the dead, then a mere 20 to 30 years, Together for Peace opines, seems too short a time for such a, quote, outlandish lie to be adopted and believed about Jesus. This claim doesn't withstand even the scrutiny of the Bible itself. For example, if the Gospels are to be believed, outlandish stories about Jesus were in circulation and believed by some people prior to Jesus' death. For example, both the Gospels of Mark and Matthew tell us that Herod Antipas claimed Jesus was John the Baptist raised from the dead. Now, keep in mind, Herod Antipas was the one who had ordered John the Baptist's execution. Mark and Matthew also indicate that other people believed this about Jesus, and that this belief was widespread enough to have reached the ears of Jesus' disciples, and eventually Jesus himself. So during the life of Jesus, while he was walking around, there were some people who believed that John the Baptist, a man who was approximately the same age as Jesus, had been raised from the dead in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. People believed this, including, most astonishingly, the man who had ordered John's execution. If this outlandish claim could garner adherents during the life of Jesus, it's not at all difficult to believe that any number of outlandish claims could have developed and garnered adherents 20 to 30 years after Jesus' life, including a claim that Jesus himself had been raised from the dead. As Professor Thomas Sheehan of Stanford University quite correctly observes in his great book, The First Coming, How the Kingdom of God Became Christianity, quote, in first century Palestine, belief in a resurrection did not depend on cemetery records. It's also worth noting that the four Gospels themselves provide clear insight into how a story, even an outlandish story, can develop and gain adherents within a relatively short period of time. Mark's post-resurrection story, the earliest of the four canonical Gospels, is rather stark and minimal. News of Jesus' resurrection does not inspire joy and faith, but rather fear, bewilderment, and silence. Moreover, Jesus never appears. As time goes on and Matthew's Gospel is written, then Luke's Gospel, then John's Gospel, the story becomes much richer, taking on a variety of new details that often seem aimed at correcting the starkness of the Markan version. In short, the further away in time from the alleged events of that Sunday morning, the more richly detailed the stories about those events became. Second, it's important to have a sense of the criteria historians use to determine which sources can reasonably be relied upon to establish what probably is and is not historical fact. Among other things, historians look for contemporary sources that corroborate one another. that are consistent with one another. With respect to the claim that Jesus was raised from the dead, the Christian scriptures, even if they can be considered contemporary sources, are certainly not sources that corroborate one another. In fact, they're often astoundingly inconsistent. I did a video last year on the glaring inconsistencies among the post-resurrection narratives in the Gospels, linked to the right of the screen for those interested. I won't go over all of those contradictions here. Rather, I'll highlight something I didn't mention in the earlier video, namely the inconsistencies about where the disciples first saw the risen Jesus. In Mark and Matthew's Gospels, an angel instructs women who had gone to Jesus' tomb to go tell the disciples that Jesus will be appearing to them up north in Galilee. Mark's angel says, "Go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he said to you." Matthew's angel says, "Go quickly and tell his disciples that he is risen from the dead. And behold, he is going before you into Galilee. There you will see him. Behold, I have told you." Matthew's gospel goes even further. It has Jesus meeting the women on their way to tell the disciples. And Jesus says, quote, "Go and take word to my brethren to leave for Galilee, and there they shall see me." Jerusalem, where Jesus was executed and buried, was in Judea, about 70 miles south of Galilee. So the disciples had a bit of a trip ahead of them before they would see Jesus. Matthew 28:16-17 tells us that, quote, "The 11 disciples proceeded to Galilee," unquote, where they, quote, "saw him." The angels who appear to the women at Jesus' tomb in Luke's gospel say nothing to them about the disciples heading north to Galilee to see Jesus. And Luke's Jesus starts appearing to his disciples, quote, "that very day," in and immediately around Jerusalem. After this series of appearances in and immediately around Jerusalem, nothing about Galilee, Luke has Jesus and the disciples go to Bethany, once again just a short distance outside Jerusalem, where Jesus, quote, "parted from them." In Luke's version, there is not one word about the disciples going to Galilee. All the action is in and around Jerusalem. In fact, Luke's Jesus commands the disciples not to leave Jerusalem, while Matthew's Jesus commanded them to leave Jerusalem to head for Galilee. John's gospel also avoids the whole go to Galilee to see Jesus thing. On Sunday evening, John has Jesus appearing in Jerusalem, where the disciples are not preparing for a trip to Galilee, but rather are behind locked doors, quote, "for fear of the Jews." Jesus makes his first appearance to the disciples there in Jerusalem. According to John, the action does not move to Galilee until Jesus' third appearance to the disciples. For those of you keeping score, Matthew's Jesus commands the disciples to leave Jerusalem, and he makes his first appearance on a mountain in Galilee, while Luke's Jesus makes all of his appearances in and around Jerusalem and commands his disciples not to leave Jerusalem. John's Jesus makes his first and second appearances in Jerusalem. It's not until his third appearance that the action moves to Galilee, and there the appearance is not on a mountain, but on a beach. One needn't be a professional historian to see that there's nothing for the historian to work with here. These are not sources that corroborate one another. Rather, they contradict one another directly and in a variety of ways. In some, they fail as contemporary sources that corroborate one another, that are consistent with one another, and therefore, at least with respect to Jesus' resurrection, cannot be viewed as historical evidence. Well, I'm out of time. Thanks, everyone.